The station hung in the black like a wound that had refused to scar. Kepler Concord Station was once the glittering jewel of neutrality in a war-torn sector. 1,000 meters across, it orbited the dying red dwarf of Anseth Prime, balanced in the gravity well like a coin on its edge. Built by human hands and funded in part by SCIFI bioalloy contributions, it had been a symbol of fragile cooperation, part embassy, part trade port, part dream. Now its hull was a graveyard. Burnt struts jutted out like fractured ribs. Its once gleaming panels were now a patchwork of carbon scoring and open exposure, bleeding frozen vapor into the vacuum. The communication spires had collapsed inward during the siege, and the great garden dome, once home to imported Terran moss and floating thalkewire pollen flowers, had ruptured. Nothing green remained. The only thing that moved across its scorched belly was a rust-colored speck, a mining tug, compact and ugly, inching toward a forgotten docking ring. The halcyon grudge had no elegance, no war record, and no permits. But she moved with purpose. Inside, Elijah Rourke leaned over the console, eyes narrowed against the glow. Manual override engaged. Engine thrusters at half-burn. Hands firm on the control yoke. He didn't trust machines with ghost work. Not this close to the line. The cockpit was cramped and thick with heat. Spare parts hung from netting overhead. Rations, coolant packs, tools, organized chaos. Every bolt had been turned at least twice since the war. The grudge had been cobbled together from 3 separate vessels and a dozen scrapyards, held aloft by grit and miracles. Elijah spoke to her like an old hound with a bad hip. "Easy now, girl," he muttered. "One more docking port, and then you can rest your rusty bones." He swept low past the station's underbelly, his eyes flicking across what remained of the external structure. A defensive cannon, half-slagged and frozen mid-turn. Airlock breach scars. Docking gantries sheared off at the root. And finally, port C6. Still intact somehow. A miracle or bait. He clamped the tug to the port with a hiss of retro thrusters. The magnetic lock thudded home with a sharp clang, deep and resonant. No external response. No signals. Just a blinking beacon on emergency reserve. Elijah powered down the engines. The silence was so complete, it buzzed in his ears. Then he saw her. A figure stood within the port's observation deck, unmoving. Her silhouette was tall and straight, robed in ceremonial gray. No breathing mask, though the atmosphere here had to be razor-thin. Light shimmered around her, subtle bioluminescence from the gold filaments woven into her sleeves. He knew the look, even before the face came into view. Thalkewire. His stomach turned to rust. He had seen those robes before. On the battlefield. In the aftermath. Their elegance didn't disguise what they were. Empath healers, war priestesses, grief guides. The Thalkewire believed in emotional purity, in the cleansing of psychic wounds. They sang the dead into stillness. Elijah didn't trust anyone who sang to corpses. Still, he suited up. No one else had answered the beacon. And if she was here alone, she wouldn't last long. The grudge's airlock cycled open. His boots rang on the rusted metal. He wore his patched vac suit, helmet sealed, duct tape around the joints. Plasma cutter on his hip, just in case. The internal lights flickered as he stepped across. She didn't flinch. He halted 3 paces away, visor lowered, one hand on his belt. "You human?" she asked, voice soft but resonant, like 2 notes layered on top of each other. One cool, one brittle. He studied her. Silver skin marbled with pale veins. Eyes like pools of mercury. No weapons. No fear. "Last I checked," he said. "You the welcoming committee?" "I am Karishul, healer of the 6th bloom." "Name or sermon?" She blinked. Slowly. "It is who I am. Elijah Rourke. Mechanic. Not of any particular bloom." She tilted her head. Not confusion, consideration. "You came because of the distress call." "I came because someone lit a beacon in the dark," Elijah said. "And that usually means someone's dying or desperate, which are both kinds of broken I can work with." Kari regarded him for a long moment. "Your species runs toward pain. That is unusual. Among the Thalkewire, grief is a wound to be sterilized. Among humans," he said, "it's fuel." Kari turned and walked deeper into the station. Didn't ask him to follow. Just expected it. And he did. Because that's what humans did. The main corridor was a tunnel of wreckage. The atmosphere barely reached acceptable pressure, and only because she diverted the last backup scrubber unit to this level. The air stank of old smoke and electrical discharge. Cracked insulation spilled from exposed wiring. Somewhere far off, a ventilation fan squealed like a dying animal. "You keep this place running solo?" Elijah asked. "I maintain it," she said. He didn't respond. He was already running diagnostics in his head. Lights flickered with low power frequency. No gravlift hum. Cooling system struggling. The walls groaned with structural fatigue. This place should have folded in on itself weeks ago. Kari paused beside a shattered viewport. Beyond it, the skeletal ribs of the station's second ring twisted out into space. That had once been the habitation sector. He could still see faint scorch lines where escape pods had failed to launch. "You're here alone?" "Yes." "And why's that?" The reconstruction effort was deprioritized. That's one way of saying they gave up. Kari didn't answer. He stopped walking, turned to face her. "You called for help." "Why me?" "I did not request you specifically." "Well, I'm all you got." She looked at him, studying something behind his words. "I sent the signal because the station has value," she said. "Not just symbolic. Its position is central to 3 shipping lanes. If it can be restored." "It won't be." Elijah's voice was flat. "It's scrap. Maybe worth a few engines and memory cores. Nothing else." She seemed to consider that. Then, quietly, "Then help me make it more than scrap." "You think we can build trust with scrap metal?" he asked. "I think we can build anything, if we choose to." "That's the problem." Elijah looked away. "I'm not sure I do." Kari took a breath. "Then let the work decide." His gut said to turn around. Scrap the parts he needed, leave the rest, sell the alloys to the nearest black market yard, and spend the credits on new shield coils. But he looked at her. Something in her posture, rigid, upright, but fraying at the edges, made him pause. She didn't wear her grief on the outside, but he'd seen enough of it in himself to recognize the shape. He nodded once. "Show me the reactor." The doors to the main reactor were sealed with blast clamps, one half-slag from the inside. Took him 20 minutes to cut a new access panel, another 10 to disable the magnetic lockouts. Kari stood by, watching without interrupting. When the door finally groaned open, stale air hit them like a slap. It was hot and thin and smelled of insulation and blood. The reactor was dark. The pulse core sat dormant in its cradle, coolant lines dry. Half the diagnostic panels had burned out. Elijah stepped inside and felt the hairs on his neck rise. "Someone tried to overload this," he said. Kari nodded. "Sabotage." During the retreat, he crouched by the main control node, flicking his light over the scorched circuitry. They wanted to take the station with them, or keep it from being used again. He grunted, pulled a fusion wrench from his belt, and started opening junction covers. Burned conduits crumbled under his fingers. He found a cracked coolant manifold and spat a curse. Melted through the socket seal. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were breaking. He reached into his kit, pulled a spare pressure seal ring, Old Navy issue, long expired, and jammed it into place. The connection sparked once, then held. "You gonna just stand there?" he muttered. "I do not interfere in mechanical rights," Kari said, solemn. He glanced back. "You're a real piece of work. I was assembled with care." He worked in silence for nearly an hour. She stayed nearby, saying little. But he noticed she never stopped watching him. Not like she didn't trust him, but like she was learning him. When the reactor's secondary grid flickered to life, just a heartbeat of light and hum, Kari inhaled sharply. "You rebuilt it." "No," he said. "I reminded it how to breathe." She stepped forward, not close enough to touch, just near enough that he felt her presence in the room's sudden warmth. "Will you stay?" she asked. Elijah looked around. At the ruins. At the silence. At her. He was a mechanic. He didn't fix people. But maybe, just maybe, he could fix something with one. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Guess I will." He didn't smile. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. And far above them, somewhere in the broken bones of the station, a backup relay pinged to life. The station remembered how to hope. The station breathed again, but just barely. Kepler Concorde's ancient life support coughed stale air through fractured ducts. It had been designed for graceful redundancy, but after years of neglect and the slow, choking violence of orbital siege, even the bones of the place creaked. The internal temperature hovered just above freezing in most corridors, except for a few insulated chambers near the reactor core where it climbed high enough to fog the windows with breath and condensation. Lights flickered to life one sector at a time, some steady, others stuttering like an old soldier with a busted knee trying to stand again. Elijah Rourke stood on a graded catwalk overlooking what had once been the central junction, a circular chamber 2 decks high, surrounded by branching corridors leading to habitation, engineering, logistics, and a long-abandoned Thalkar meditation wing. The chamber's upper gallery bore the melted remains of diplomatic banners, one of which had been stitched from human Kevlar and Thalkar silk, a symbol of the Alliance, or maybe a warning to the future. The banners hadn't burned clean. Nothing in this place had. Below, Kari knelt by the floor, her long fingers tracing a faint scar etched into the bulkhead. It was a deep gouge, curved and purposeful, not the random violence of shrapnel, but something ritualistic. "Memory mark," she said quietly. "A grief carving. It records pain." She looked up at him. "Do humans not leave theirs behind?" Elijah leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "We bottle it up until it explodes. Or we drink it away. Some of us carve names into tree bark. Graves. Dog tags." She studied him. Her eyes were the color of metal dust in water, soft, unfixed, ever-shifting. "You wear no memorial. Doesn't mean I don't carry one." She didn't ask more. That was something he liked about her. She didn't prod. Just listened, observed, and filed things away in her alien mind. They moved through the junction in tandem. Elijah patched 2 shattered consoles using salvaged relays from a disused fire suppression system. Kari silently deactivated a half-crushed memory pod embedded in the wall to preserve the psychic residue. It wasn't just machines that stored data here. The Thalkar had always believed pain could be archived, that sorrow remembered could teach the future. "Doesn't it get heavy?" Elijah asked as she wrapped the pod in a polymer shroud. "It already is," she said simply. Hours passed. The groan came from somewhere deep beneath the decks, a substructural flex or a stress fracture in the habitat ring's spine. Elijah stiffened, hand drifting instinctively to his cutter. "Sounded like a hull shift," he muttered. "No breach," Kari replied. "Yet." He snorted. "Cheery." They passed a corridor lined with what had once been hydroponics tubes, now shattered and dry. Dead vines curled in brittle clumps against the floor. Water stains marked the walls like ghost veins. The air was colder here. Not the dry cold of space-purged metal, but the clammy chill of trapped decay. Elijah's boots scuffed across flakes of peeling sealant. Each step echoed too loudly. A burst pipe hissed in the distance, releasing steam that carried the scent of rust and old blood. Kari paused beside a mural, Thalkar pigment, bioluminescent and faint, but still flickering like a dying constellation. Though cracked and scorched, it retained its shape, a spiral of color, collapsing inward to a dark center. "This record's a bloom death," she said. "A vow made by the dying to the unborn. Their pain promised as guidance." Elijah stared. "You paint your last words on walls?" "We project them. The pigment reacts to unresolved grief. Real cheerful aesthetic you got." She smiled faintly. "You people have graves. And fireworks." "Fair point." He ran a hand along the mural, feeling the chill of the alloy underneath. "You people got a whole language for sorrow. Because we feel it constantly." "So do we," he said. "We just suck at admitting it." She looked at him then, not a glance, but a long, quiet study. And then, softly, "Perhaps that is why you burned so brightly." Artificial night came slowly. The station's chronometers were offline, but their bodies remembered tiredness. Kari gave him a ration cube, mint and ash. Elijah grimaced, but chewed. He passed her his thermos of recycled coffee. She sipped, coughed, and winced. "Your rituals are caustic. You haven't tried real whiskey yet." She raised an eyebrow. "I have read the chemical composition. It is also poison." "Exactly." Later, they returned to the habitation wing. The path took them through areas where gravity flickered, where the floor was tilted slightly off-axis, and where structural beams had warped into the shape of pain. Elijah climbed a collapsed stairwell with groaning knees and the occasional curse. Kari floated upward, suspended by a field of faint shimmer. "Not anti-grav." "Not quite." "You gonna tell me how that works?" he asked. "It is not meant for transport. It is meant for mourning." He didn't push further. The hallway smelled like rust and old breath. Every door along the row was either fused shut or hanging open. Elijah kicked one aside and stepped into what had once been a mess hall. Melted trays. A child's toy in the corner. A charred human handprint on the wall. Kari turned away. Elijah didn't. "Wasn't just soldiers," he said. "They wanted this place wiped clean." Kari's voice was distant. "My people believed holding it would prolong the suffering. So you burned it instead." "So we burned it," she corrected. Neither side left this place untouched. He didn't argue. Couldn't. They salvaged what they could: thermal blankets, a half-charged battery cell, a working heat lamp, a cracked toy shaped like a Terran bear. Kari held it in her long fingers for a long time before placing it gently in a satchel. Then they found the body. Human. Female. Curled in a corner beneath emergency foil. Mummified in the thin air, teeth clenched. A long, slow death. Elijah crouched, pulled the foil gently back. Her face was dry, lips parted as if to speak one last time. Kari knelt beside him, hand hovering inches from the woman's cheek. "I feel no final pain," she said. "Only waiting." Elijah reached for the woman's wrist. There was a small engraved bracelet there. Tasha Rourke. His breath caught. His throat closed around the air like a noose. A memory tried to surface: laughter in a dry dock hangar, grease-stained hands holding a welding mask too big for her face, but he shoved it down, buried it in the same place he buried everything else. Kari froze. "You knew her." He stood too fast. Something cracked in his knee. He turned away, fast and hard. "Let's move," he said, voice thick. "We've got power to reroute." Kari didn't press. She stood, eyes unreadable, but her hands trembled for a moment, not from fear, but from resonance. Pain had a texture in the Thalkewire mind. And his felt like iron scorched and bent to the edge of breaking. They worked in silence for the next 3 hours, reconnecting thermal junctions, realigning the ventilation cycles. Elijah barely spoke. Kari did not sing, though Thalkewire mourned in song. She honored his silence. When the auxiliary generator rumbled to life with a rattling hum, the entire corridor seemed to exhale. Warmth seeped into the walls. Kari turned to him, not with words, but with a look. Recognition. Grief. And maybe, just maybe, with something like understanding. Outside, the red dwarf pulsed dimly against the black, and the station endured another night. But something had changed. 2 survivors. 1 scar deeper. And beneath it all, a heartbeat in the metal, steady and slow, alive again. The leak didn't announce itself with drama. It hissed. A long, steady exhalation of compressed air, barely audible beneath the station's ambient groans. But to Elijah's trained ear, it was louder than an alarm klaxon. He snapped upright from the open panel he was repairing in the lower engineering ring and turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. The sound was coming from behind the bulkhead, near the water reclamation array, which, if memory served, was located directly above a dormant plasma conduit and 2 levels beneath the power junction. He muttered a curse. "Not a day, sweetheart." Kari, who had been examining a cracked data terminal with delicate reverence, looked up from across the chamber. Her long fingers hovered over the remains of a shattered holographic relay, etched with Thalkewire tracer lines that still shimmered faintly. "Is something wrong?" Just a little death whisper in the walls. "Stay here." "I believe I will not." They reached the array together, Elijah jogging with a toolbox, Kari gliding in her quiet, ghost-like way, and found the source. A breach in the water main, worn from years of microfractures and thermal stress. Steam poured into the compartment, already condensing on the walls and forming slick puddles on the floor. The temperature was rising rapidly. "It's not just water," Elijah said, voice tight. "This steam's loaded with trace lithium and ammonium. The coolant line's been compromised." Kari stepped closer, holding her sleeve to her mouth, the other hand braced against a wall whose alloy skin had begun to warp from the heat. "What does that mean?" "It means if we don't seal it fast, the vapor will short half this level's circuits. And if the heat climbs another few degrees." The conduit behind them let out a low, ominous pop. Elijah flinched, grabbed Kari's shoulder. "Out. Now." They sprinted down the corridor, her more graceful, him more stubborn, just as a secondary valve burst with a roar behind them. A cloud of steam chased their heels like a specter. The air was scalding now, rising fast. Elijah's boots skidded on condensation as he pulled Kari behind a support beam. Steam hissed past them in a burning wave, stinging his exposed wrist at the glove seam. The lights above snapped into emergency red, casting their faces in blood hues. Kari's footing slipped, but Elijah caught her arm. Her skin was damp and ice-cold under his glove. "Hold on," he growled. "Just a few more seconds." "Emergency shutoffs 20 meters down," Elijah yelled. "By the yellow panel." "I see it." Kari reached it first, robes trailing behind her like smoke. She slammed her hand down on the rust-caked manual override. There was a long, uncertain moment, then the hissing stopped. The station sighed. Steam thinned. Pipes groaned. Elijah leaned against the wall, drenched in sweat and condensation. He let out a breathless laugh, a wheezing sound that turned into a deep, chesty chuckle. Kari blinked. Are you injured? No. Just thinking how this heap nearly flash-boiled us because a valve was older than my dad. He wiped his face with a sleeve and shook his head. Good reflexes, by the way. She tilted her head, unsure if she'd been complimented or mocked. You did not answer my question. I'm not injured. He tapped his temple. Might be losing it, though. You began laughing in the face of mortal danger. This appears to be a pattern. He grinned. That, or a coping mechanism. Kari regarded him. Her robes clung to her frame now, darkened by moisture. She shivered once, barely visible, and Elijah noticed. Come on, he said, his tone gentler. You need dry clothes. And I need 6 hours of sleep and a drink that doesn't taste like melted plastic. They returned to a small utility chamber near the command hub, one Elijah had begun converting into something almost like living quarters. Blankets scavenged from cryo-storage. A heater core humming faintly. Even a half-working music unit, which currently played static with surprising rhythm. The room still carried the scent of engine grease and recycled air, but it was warmer than the rest of the station. A faded human photograph had been tacked to the wall, 2 kids holding up a fish on Earth. Elijah had found it in a storage locker and decided it belonged here. Elijah peeled out of his soaked jacket and tossed it over a pipe. Kari sat cross-legged on one of the makeshift mats, arms folded over her knees. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, restorative, the kind that only came after surviving something just stupid enough to be funny in hindsight. Then Kari said, Your laughter. It does not resonate with mockery. He looked over at her, surprised. Wasn't trying to mock anything. She nodded slowly. It felt like a release valve. A rupture in containment. That's exactly what it is. I understand it better now. Elijah sat down beside her. Not close, but not distant. Between them sat a container of dried meal packs. He passed her one, synthetic vegetable soup. She inspected it like it might bite her. You ever laugh? He asked. Kari hesitated. Once. In training. It startled the others. Our instructors discouraged it. Figures. But I remember it. It felt like exhaling grief. But with sound. Elijah exhaled. That's the best definition I've heard. She warmed the soup over a small heat plate. The scent rose, mingling with the ozone sting still hanging in the room. Her fingers trembled as she took a sip, then steadied. Among my people, she said, to exhale pain is a sacred act. But we do not do it with sound. We do it with stillness. With surrender. She hesitated. But too much emotion, uncontrolled, can ripple through empathic bonds. It is considered dangerous, disruptive, even contagious. And yet here you are, Elijah said. Yes, she replied. Here I am. Humans don't surrender easily, he said. Sometimes we make a joke just to keep from screaming. She considered this. That is a kind of courage. He shrugged. Or madness. Perhaps both. The line is fine. They shared a moment of quiet. The steam from the soup curled between them like incense. Then Elijah added, You know, I wasn't always like this. Laughing in the face of danger. She looked up. He ran a thumb along the edge of a cracked thermos. Used to be more serious. Cautious. The war, it teaches you weird lessons. Like how to find beauty in a broken welt. Or comedy in a flooded junction box. He remembered a younger version of himself, crouched in a dropship bay, hands shaking as orbital artillery lit up the sky outside. He hadn't laughed then. Hadn't spoken for 3 days after the survivors were counted. The first time he laughed again was at a funeral. Someone spilled coolant on the casket lift, and the damn thing slipped sideways. People gasped. He broke. Couldn't stop. That was when he knew. Grief needed cracks to escape through. Kari's gaze softened. We carry what we must. Until it changes us. He nodded. Somewhere above, the pipes gave a long, slow groan. Nothing burst. Nothing cracked. Just the sound of pressure normalizing. Kari finished her soup and handed the empty pack back. You make this place feel survivable. Elijah blinked. Now there's a line I've never heard before. It is meant as praise. He chuckled. I'll take it. And somewhere deep in the wreckage of Kepler Concorde, the final droplets of the leak hissed out their last breath. Relays rebalanced. Heat redistributed. The station was healing not just in steel, but in silence. In laughter. In presence. And for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't mournful. It was peaceful. It was shared. The storm hit without warning. Not outside the station. There was no weather in space. But in the upper relays of Kepler Concorde's decaying comms tower, A pulse of charged particles from the red dwarf Anseth Prime erupted like a solar screen. The magnetic shielding, already degraded from neglect, barely reacted. The pulse cracked through the frayed insulation and surged down the power lattice like lightning through a skeleton. Systems screamed. Lights died. Consoles sparked. Silence fell. Every light on the command deck went dark. Elijah was halfway through rerouting auxiliary power to the shattered habitation dome when the blackout hit. The system console sparked, the holoscreen blinked out, and his fingers sizzled against a suddenly hot interface. "Kari," he barked, yanking back his hand and grabbing the emergency flashlight. "Talk to me." System-wide surge, she called from the far side of the deck. Her voice was calm. Too calm. The main uplink absorbed a class, 3 solar pulse. "And you didn't see that coming? I am not an astrophysicist. I thought Thalkar could sense space. We sense emotion, not stellar emissions." He kicked the nearest panel open and dove under it with a snarl. The air stank of ozone and old coolant. Sparks danced along a severed relay like fireflies flitting through a graveyard. Kari knelt beside him a moment later. In the pale glow of his flashlight, her face looked carved from moonlight. She didn't flinch from the arcs or the heat. "What are you doing?" "Bypassing the uplink and stabilizing core flow before we melt this whole damn deck. And if that fails, then we find out what it's like to live inside a microwave." He grunted, splicing wires with calloused fingers, sweat sliding down his temple. The hum of the capacitor grew louder. One of the old coils began to shudder, vibrating with barely contained discharge. She reached out as if to help, then paused. "Your pain is amplifying the field." "Yeah, well, welcome to the human nervous system." The coil flared blue. Elijah twisted the fuse cap into place and slammed the access panel shut. The light snapped back on, dim, flickering, uncertain, but there. Kari exhaled. Containment stable. Elijah collapsed onto the floor with a groan. Hell of a Tuesday. Power was restored, but the uplink remained fried. The main communications dish hung dead on its gimbal like a lopped head. Without it, the station drifted back into isolation. No contact with orbital relays, no connection to long-range star beacons. It was as though Kepler Concord had slid backward in time. They retreated to the utility chamber again, their makeshift haven cobbled together from repair scraps and old storage bins. Blankets hung across the walls to muffle echoes. The heater core glowed faint orange. Overhead, a vent ticked like an old clock. Elijah had been searching for replacement fuses, but what he really needed was something human, something to remind him that this station had once held voices, not just systems. That was when he found it, an old entertainment module buried behind a fuse array. It was a jury-rigged playback system, designed to loop personal logs on a cracked data crystal. Someone had tucked it away beneath a towel sealed in vacuum plastic, as if hiding a memory from time itself. He looked over at Kari. She sat cross-legged, her fingers gently smoothing the folds of her robe. "Want to watch the ghosts? I will witness." He plugged it into the static sputtering unit. The screen flickered, then lit. A human woman appeared. Mid-30s. Dark skin. Short curls pulled back in a tight braid. She wore a jumpsuit bearing the Kepler crest and a diplomatic liaison's insignia. Her smile was tired, but kind. "This is Station Day 0497, she said. "Hydroponics are operational. Diplomatic intake from Thalkar emissaries begins tomorrow." Kari tilted her head. That voice is familiar. She was probably part of the original peace cohort, Elijah murmured. "Before it all went to hell." The woman continued. "Today, I taught a human child and a Thalkar bloomling to plant soil gel together. They fought over a spade. Then they laughed. That's what hope sounds like, I think." As Isla's voice filled the room, the heater core gave a soft click, and a ripple of static ran through the floor. Kari's breathing slowed, so still Elijah almost thought she'd stopped. Dust caught the glow of the screen, drifting like the weight of forgotten prayers. Elijah didn't move. His throat was tight. The image jumped. More logs played over days, then weeks. Brief moments in the life of a station still young enough to believe in unity. One entry was recorded during a lockdown. The lights behind her flickered as she spoke. "I lost someone yesterday," she whispered. "We were 5 minutes too late. It wasn't the Thalkar who did it. It was the delay. The bureaucracy. We watched him bleed out under a joint flag. That shouldn't happen." Kari's expression didn't change, but her hands slowly curled inward on her lap. Her posture had stiffened like cooling alloy. "She grieves without shielding," she said. "That is rare." Elijah nodded. She was brave. Then the final entry. The woman sat in a dim corridor lit by emergency glow. Dust floated through the air like pollen. If this message survives and the station doesn't, know that it mattered. Know that we tried. The screen went dark. Static returned. They sat in silence. Kari blinked once slowly. Elijah swallowed hard but didn't speak. They weren't ready to break the silence, not after what they'd heard. She didn't know if anyone would ever hear her, Kari said softly. She spoke into oblivion. That's what hope is, sometimes, Elijah said. Throwing your voice into the dark and praying it finds ears. Kari looked at him. Her voice is in our archives. She was present during the Accords signing ceremony. Her name was Isla Voss. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. She mattered. She was the one who suggested the first shared education pod, Kari added. She believed children could bond before adults taught them to hate. Elijah shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sounds like the kind of person the war eats first. A soft wind pushed through the ducts overhead, and the playback unit crackled faintly, as if considering whether to play again. Neither of them touched it. Instead, Kari reached for a ration cube and handed it to him without comment. They chewed in silence. Not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. Outside, the comms tower sparked again, brief, faint, like a memory surfacing through time. Inside, in a chamber lit by static and old ghosts, two survivors sat side by side. They didn't speak again that night, but they listened. And for now, that was enough. Kari stood alone in the hydroponics bay, or what was left of it. What once had been a sprawling, multi-level jungle of nutrient towers and hanging aeroponic lattices was now a hollow tomb of shattered plex and corroded steel. The bay spanned 2 decks vertically, its vaulted ceiling now sagging with warped beams and light fixtures dangling like severed limbs. Burned-out lights overhead flickered like distant stars dying. Most of the plant beds were empty, some charred, some dry, all silent. The nutrient feeds had long since clogged, and the moisture regulators were fused shut. Rot and time had made soil of hope. But one pod pulsed green. A single clump of Terran moss, clinging to the curve of a cracked root basket. It shimmered faintly under a beam of light that had forced its way through a break in the overhead casing. Its leaves curled and uncurled with slow persistence. Kari reached toward it with reverence. Her fingers hovered, not touching, just feeling. She could sense the photosynthetic hum, the subtle emotional resonance. Living things had signatures. Not sentience, not thought, but breath, rhythm, a kind of memory. Among the SCIFI gardens were more than food, they were memorials. Each root bed held residue from the emotional echoes of the dead. A morning bloom, a peace fern, a sorrow root. This moss had no such origin, and yet it survived. To the SCIFI, a living sprout on dead ground was a whisper from the universe, a sacred breach in entropy. A message not written in words, but in chlorophyll. The air near the moss felt subtly warmer. Not in temperature, but in something less measurable, like a breath held too long finally being released. Elijah, she called softly. He arrived moments later, wiping grease off his hands with an old cloth. When he stepped into the bay and saw where she stood, he froze. Is that? It is alive. He stepped closer, crouching beside her. His breath fogged slightly in the chill air. Thought nothing made it through the fire. Something did. She glanced sideways at him. Things can grow even in poisoned ground. He crouched beside her and slowly exhaled. First green thing I've seen in months. Hell, maybe longer. They worked side by side for hours. Elijah jerry-rigged a small LED panel from a scavenged maintenance light, reshaping the output lens using a shard of polished plex. Kari recalibrated the cracked irrigation pipes using SCIFI resonance tuning, humming a low note that made the filters unclog just enough to trickle. Her voice seemed to melt old clogs like thawing ice. She explained that her people once grew floating gardens in the void between asteroid clusters. They fed on radiation, sipped starwind, and bloomed only when surrounded by silence. Elijah told her how his grandmother's houseplants outlived 4 cats and 2 husbands. They laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because the moss started to spread. Within a few hours, the fronds had tripled in size. New filaments stretched cautiously across the rim of the root basket. A tendril touched the rusted nutrient pipe and began to trace along its line like a blind creature discovering its world. By the time the lights dimmed for night cycle, the first hint of green had pushed a frond outward. It swayed slightly, as if reaching for the sound of Kari's hum. Kari touched Elijah's shoulder. This is not just a plant. It is proof. Proof of what? That not everything needs to be rebuilt. Some things, some lives, just need to be allowed to continue. He looked at her, at the moss, at the ruined bay, and the gentle pulse of chlorophyll clinging to bent metal. I guess I needed to see that. We all do. They didn't say anything else, but their hands kept working, stabilizing, coaxing, aligning the room's fractured life support umbilicals so that, piece by piece, one corner of the station would no longer feel like a tomb. Later that night, when Kari had returned to her quarters, an old Thalkay-wire meditation cell re-insulated with patches of salvaged synth fiber, Elijah returned to the bay alone. He brought with him a sheet of reflective alloy, scuffed but whole. It had once been part of a mining drone shell. He bolted it to the ceiling, angling it with spacers and joints so it would redirect light perfectly into the plant bed. He didn't hum, didn't speak. He just watched the moss for a while. It reminded him of a field behind his father's scrapyard on Mars, a patch of green and red dust that grew despite the engine runoff. He hadn't thought of that place in years. And for the first time in months, the station smelled faintly, not of rust, or coolant, or scorched metal, but of green. The following morning, Kari awoke to the sound of dripping. Not an alert, not a failure, just water, clean, filtered, and rhythmic. She sat up quickly, disoriented at first. The station rarely sounded like life. When she followed the sound, it led her not to a leak, but to the hydroponics chamber. Elijah was already there, fussing with the regulator. I patched a valve from the med-bay still kit, he said without turning. Not exactly rated for sustained moisture output, but it'll do. The moss had doubled in size again. Kari walked slowly around the pod, noting the spread. It had begun to send rootlets into the adjacent beds, barely a breath of growth, but unmistakable. This plant is not native to this climate. Nothing here is, Elijah said. That's the point. She smiled faintly. Resilience and defiance of context. Something like that. He stood, wiping his hands on his pants, and looked at her. Really looked. I'm not sure why this matters so damn much, he said. But it does. Kari nodded. It matters because it defies expectation. Because it tells us that the rules we think govern decay and death aren't absolute. Elijah turned to face the moss again. That's a fancy way of saying life finds a way. I am told humans enjoy aphorisms. You have no idea. They stood together for a long time in silence. The light curved gently from the reflector above. The irrigation hissed softly. A faint breeze stirred the moss, rustling like whispering silk. And in the dark guts of Kepler Concord, surrounded by vacuum and ghosts, something delicate, something impossible, was growing. Not because it was engineered to survive, but because no one had told it not to. It started with a flicker, not in the lights, but in the static. The station's communication console had been dead for days, ever since the solar pulse had turned half the array into slag. The uplink dish still hung limp on its shattered spindle, half tilted like a broken jaw. No telemetry, no burst relays. They hadn't bothered with the console since. The effort felt pointless. Even if they could transmit, who would listen? The alliance was gone. The Thalkay-wire assembly had severed comms. And the stars weren't in the mood to talk. But the static changed. Kari noticed it first. She was passing through the command deck on her way to check structural seal integrity near the aft pylon when she paused beside the old playback unit. The screen still played its endless hiss of visual snow and white noise, occasionally spitting sparks from a damaged crystal socket. Only now, the noise wasn't uniform. There was rhythm, a pattern beneath the randomness. A stutter, a pulse. Not music, but not chaos either. Like a breath trying to become a word. She stood still. Every Thalkay-wire cell in her body reacted to subtle variance. To Kari, the difference was palpable, almost tactile, as if the room had inhaled. Elijah, she called, her voice low. He arrived moments later, crowbar slung across his back and a satchel of repair fuses hanging from his belt. His hands were smeared with rust dust and oil, eyes squinting against the decks flickering overheads. What's up? Listen. He tilted his head, frowned. That's just the old log loop. It's corrupt. No, it's trying to do something else. He squatted in front of the screen and flicked the side of the unit. The static rippled, and for a second, an image appeared. Not Isla Voss. Not any of the archived logs. Just a flash, a glyph, etched in harsh violet and overlaid with a triangular formation of dots. It looked like nothing either of them had ever seen. Then it vanished. Did you see that? Kari nodded. I did not recognize the language. It wasn't Thalkay-wire, or human, or anything I've seen in a standard databank. The static buzzed again, then stilled. For the next hour, they pulled the playback unit apart, gently, carefully, reverently. The casing gave way to a fusion of Terran ceramic and SCIFI psychotropic mesh. The memory crystal inside was scorched at the edges, but its core flickered intermittently. Elijah attached a signal sniffer to the output port and traced power flow across the rerouted junctions. The readings weren't just corrupted, they were new. Packet bursts riding on subharmonic frequencies, hidden in the white noise. No encryption, no metadata, but structured, intentional. Something's piggybacking the carrier wave, he muttered. But from where? Kari's eyes narrowed. The uplink dish is inert. There is no network access, no outbound or inbound feeds. Even internal subroutines are offline, Elijah said. This thing isn't just piggybacking, it's creating a path through dead systems. Kari didn't answer. Her gaze had gone to the screen. The glyph returned again. Brighter now, sharper. It pulsed twice, then again, then 3 times in succession. She swallowed. Elijah, I think it's looking at us. He stared at her. Kari, there's nothing looking at us. It's just a symbol, a pattern. No, look closer. He stepped forward, and in that instant, the station's lighting dimmed by a fraction. Not a power failure. A soft flicker, as if the power hesitated. And the console hissed again. From the glyph came a sound. A single tone. High, hollow, and old. It wasn't broadcast through speakers. It didn't vibrate in the floor or walls. It seemed to exist just behind the eyes. Like a memory from a dream you weren't sure was yours. Kari's breath hitched. That tone. It resonates in the grief centers. How do you know? She pressed her hand to her chest. Because I feel it. Outside the station, the stars continued their slow, unblinking observation. Inside, the playback unit began pulsing in sync with the emergency lighting, once every 11 seconds. Not a warning, a beacon, a heartbeat. Elijah tried to cut the feed. The moment he disconnected the power line, the glyph appeared again. This time, it blinked 4 times. And when he reattached it, a new signal bloomed across the screen. A curve of symbols. Not letters. Not known logic. But a spiral. Kari stared. That looks like a SCIFI dream echo. A mind map. But it's corrupted. Or co-opted, Elijah said. The spiral shimmered. Then expanded. Not digitally. Psychically. Kari staggered back, gasping. It touched me. Like a hand through smoke. Familiar, but not mine. It remembered something I've never known. You all right? Elijah moved to her side, catching her before she slumped. Her skin was cold. It's learning. It's not transmitting to us. It's probing. For what? Kari's voice was barely a whisper. Recognition. Later, they sealed the room. Not out of fear. Out of reverence. Out of caution. The playback unit remained active. Every few minutes, the spiral changed form. Sometimes it narrowed. Sometimes it opened. Each shift accompanied by subtle tones, each one brushing at Kari's mind like an inquisitive breeze. Elijah couldn't feel them, not directly, but he could see their effect. Kari began drawing in her sleep. Spiral shapes, triangular patterns, violet on black. Elijah started rerouting power away from the command deck. He created a manual buffer, old Terran copper lines twisted through ceramic sheaths, to isolate whatever signal might still pulse through the station's veins. He left one line open, a diagnostic feed, a heartbeat monitor, just in case. On the 7th day, the signal changed. The glyph resolved itself. The triangle of dots opened into a ring, and inside it, at the center, a new image formed. A silhouette formed from refracted light and impossible angles. No eyes, but it watched. No face, but it saw. As if space itself had been carved to observe. Neither of them spoke. And Kepler Concord, no longer just a grave, no longer only a nursery, became something else. A threshold, and the thing on the other side was knocking. Kari couldn't sleep. The glyph had stopped pulsing hours ago, but it lingered in her thoughts like an afterimage burned onto the inside of her eyes. The spiral had resolved into that impossible silhouette, neither form nor void, but something in between, and now it haunted every breath she took aboard Kepler Concord. She had tried to meditate, to anchor her mind in the disciplined stillness taught in the deeper orders of SCIFI mourners. But every time she reached for stillness, she found resonance. Echoes not her own. Grief she didn't recognize, but felt just as keenly. Something had rooted in her thoughts. Not malicious, but present. In the stillness of her quarters, She traced the outline of that shape again. Not on paper. In thought. Her fingers flexed unconsciously, sketching lines in the air. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a presence. She rose and moved quietly through the half-lit corridor. The station's night cycle was soft now, thanks to Elijah's power rebalance. The lighting dimmed gradually instead of cutting out like before. She appreciated that. It gave her time to feel the dark. As she passed through the old crew habitat wing, her steps echoed with a low hum. Not from her boots, but from the station itself. The sound of aged metal under stress. Pipes shivering in quiet rhythms. Kepler Concord wasn't just a relic. It was a body, old and weary, full of forgotten breath. She passed the moss chamber. The green was still growing. One of the fronds had crawled its way up the side of a broken nutrient pipe, now curling near the heat plate Elijah had welded into place. Life was stubborn. So was death. They wrestled here, leaf by rusted leaf. Next to the plant bed, a single lumicube had been placed on the floor. Not active, not necessary, but symbolic. Kari remembered how Elijah had said, even weeds need a lamp sometimes. She reached the sealed command deck and stopped. No tones. No light. The playback unit sat dormant, like a shrine waiting for prayer. She didn't enter, just stood and breathed. Elijah's not going to like this, she murmured to herself. A voice behind her, you're right. I don't. She turned. He leaned against the bulkhead in his patchy, grease-smudged jacket, arms crossed, eyes dark with fatigue. You've been watching me? You left a trail of psych ink from your quarters, and I rerouted a sensor relay 2 days ago. He nodded toward the ceiling. You're not as subtle as you think. She smiled faintly. Neither are you. They stood in silence, both staring at the sealed chamber. The quiet between them was heavier than usual. You think it's still listening? Elijah asked. Kari nodded. I think it never stopped. He didn't respond at first. Just rubbed the scar on his knuckle, the one from a hydraulic coupling that exploded 2 stations ago. Kari, he said finally. What if it's not trying to talk? She turned. Then what? What if it's trying to remember? Kari blinked. You believe it's recovering memory? He shrugged. Or building one. From us. From what we feel. What we think. Her breath caught. That made sense in a way that chilled her. Not language. Not broadcast. But observation, noting what echoed. What struck. What lingered. That would make it. Alive, she whispered. Or something close. Later that day, the playback unit activated without warning. No spiral. No glyph. Just a light. Soft. Indescribable. A color not on any visible spectrum, yet unmistakably felt. Kari stepped into the chamber before Elijah could stop her. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air thickened. Not literally, but psychically. Like walking into a memory not your own. Her senses bent, sound dulled, gravity felt skewed, and her own emotional resonance suddenly echoed back at her, amplified. The walls shimmered, not visually, but emotionally, ghost impressions of movement, fear, awe. Not hers. Not Elijah's. Maybe not even human or Thalkewire. She gasped. Elijah, she said. I think it's asking a question. What kind of question? He said, not daring to enter. She didn't answer. She was crying. Not from fear. Not from sadness. But from the overwhelming sense that something very old had noticed her grief, and instead of recoiling from it, it had reached toward it. Like moss, curling toward warmth. The color brightened. The station's lighting dimmed further. Kari knelt, spontaneously, without command, because standing felt presumptuous. It didn't speak. It didn't demand. It just witnessed. Images formed, not on the screen, but in her thoughts. A ship of impossible design, each surface folding into itself like glass and gravity woven together. Its wake left no trail, only silence and refracted memory. It moved like it had once known where it was going, and had forgotten long ago. A war, not between species, but between echoes and fire. A fracture in space, where memory leaked out like blood from a wound. And then a silence so complete, so vast, that entire civilizations had collapsed inside it without leaving a whisper. But Kepler Concord had remained. And in that station, scorched, forgotten, rebuilt leaf by leaf, 2 voices had refused to go silent. It had heard them, and now, it wanted to remember with them. Kari's hands trembled. The chamber was no longer a room. It was a mind, an interface, and it was learning to feel. She whispered into the light. "We remember." The chamber pulsed. A low, harmonic resonance spread through the walls, into the floor, into the very air ducts and bones of the station. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a mirror, reflecting not what was spoken, but what was meant. Kari rose. Her eyes glowed faintly violet. She turned to Elijah, who stood rooted at the threshold, eyes wide. Elijah's breath caught. He'd seen reactors melt and hulls rupture in vacuum, watched soldiers break under pressure, but never this. Whatever was touching Kari, it wasn't hostile, but it was vast, bigger than any war, any species. He felt like a gear inside a watch trying to understand time itself. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because the station listened back. And somewhere in her thoughts, unbidden, came a phrase that didn't belong to her. Eyes without names. Watching. Waiting. Remembering. She didn't know if it was hers, or the station's. And for the first time in lifetimes, something else did too. Something without name. Something with eyes that did not see light, but memory. Elijah couldn't stop thinking about the light. Not the color, he couldn't describe that if he tried. It wasn't violet, or silver, or heatless flame. It was what it did to Kari. The way it took her silence and returned it not with words, but with acknowledgement. No language. No noise. Just a shared moment that felt older than the stars they orbited. She hadn't spoken much since. Neither had he. Some things didn't need sound. He stood in the moss chamber, watching green curl upward toward the overhead light. The chamber felt warmer. Not by temperature, but by presence. The moss was flowering now, thin, pale blossoms that shimmered faintly under Elijah's handmade reflector. They released spores in slow spirals, like incense from ancient shrines. He hadn't even known moss could flower. Kari stepped in without speaking. She moved differently now, more fluid, more attuned, as if the rhythm of the station had worked its way into her spine. She sat on the deck, robes folding around her legs, and looked at the bloom. "They're responding to the station's field shifts," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "The hell does that mean?" "It means the moss has begun interpreting the station's harmonics. It's adapting, evolving." He blinked. "You saying this thing's listening to?" Kari nodded. "It always was. But now it remembers." He crouched beside the pipe. The moss brushed his gloves. It no longer felt soft. It felt aware. Not conscious in the human or Thalkewire sense, but intentional. Growing with purpose. "That's creepy," he muttered. Kari smiled. "It is sacred." The command deck's sealed door opened for them 2 days later. Neither of them touched a panel. No override. No code. It just opened. The playback unit had changed. It no longer looked like a salvage display bolted into corroded bulkhead. It was seamless now, the surface smooth, responsive to presence. The air shimmered faintly when they entered, like walking through the surface of still water. The color returned when Kari entered, violet, faint, pulsing like breath. Elijah followed, expecting the hue to fade. It held, not just for her, but for both of them. "What's it doing?" he asked. Kari tilted her head, learning to communicate, but not in a language of words. A panel illuminated beside them, etched with shifting lines of botanical fractals, mirrored by old Thalkewire morning scripts and Terran alphanumerics. It looked like an impossible artifact, half data map, half ritual tablet. At the center, a symbol burned. The spiral. Not static. Alive. She stepped forward and placed her palm against it. The chamber responded, not with noise, but with growth. Vines of moss burst from the corners of the room, not wildly, not chaotically. They spiraled, climbed, blossomed. Not invasive. Harmonious. They wrapped gently around bulkheads, coating steel in softness. Tiny points of light shimmered at the vine tips, like stars blooming from root systems. And through it, a hum began. Not mechanical. Musical. A tone with no instrument. It was a song of atmosphere pressure, of magnetic field sway, of ancient systems reactivating not out of function, but reverence. Kari knelt. "It's using memory as a voice." "What kind of memory?" Elijah asked, breathless. "Not data," she said. "Emotion. Loss. Love. Witnessed pain and unburied hope." He felt it too, then not in words, but in the way his old scars ached slightly, and the room felt suddenly aware of them. Of everything he carried that he didn't say. The symbol shifted again. A bloom opened beside Kari's hand. Inside was a seed. Oval. Semi-translucent. Glowing with a pulse that matched the station's. She looked up at Elijah. "It wants to give us something." He crouched beside her. The seed glowed faintly, neither metal nor plant, a hybrid of synthesis and nature. Its surface reflected Kari's face and his own, not literally, but in expression. Grief, resolve, wonder. Elijah looked at the flowering moss, the shifting glyphs, the memory-driven song vibrating through the floor. "It's not a message," he said slowly. Kari smiled. "It's an answer." She lifted the seed. It was warm in her hand, not physically, but emotionally, like the warmth of being held, or of sunlight on a grave. "I think it's a kind of bridge," she whispered, "between what was forgotten and what might grow next." They stood together. Elijah watched her, and the moss, and the light that no longer came from wires. It struck him then, humanity had traveled stars, broken atoms, and still understood nothing of connection. But this was something they'd never written in their histories, something they'd only just begun to feel. And Kepler Concord bloomed in silence. Later, in the hydroponics bay, Kari and Elijah planted the seed. They cleared a small bed, one once meant for nutrient gel root vegetables, and placed the seed inside a new substrate made from station biowaste, cryogenic moss, and pulverized memory crystal. The soil pulsed faintly when they did. Kari pressed her hand into the soil. It's speaking in the only way grief can, through a language of ash and bloom. The light shifted. Not the station's light. Reality itself. Just a tremor. A moment. But enough for Kari to whisper, "It knows we accept it." They stood over it in silence. Elijah didn't know what to expect. Roots? Light? A signal? Nothing came. And somehow, that meant everything. As they turned to leave, the moss in the chamber bloomed again. All of it. At once. Not in chaos, but in chorus. As if saying, "You heard us. Now we'll grow." It began in the wiring. A low pulse, too subtle for the eye. Oscillations along copper and ceramic conduits that hadn't carried meaning in decades. The moss had spread through them like veins, not just across walls or ducts, but inside, threading where no root should reach. Not destroying. Connecting. Kepler Concord was changing. The transformation was subtle at first. Lights flickered in dead corridors, ones they hadn't entered since the collapse of the tertiary ring. Old consoles booted without power draws, showing patterns, rhythms, glyphs and pulsing violet and green. No commands. No requests. Just presence. The sense of something here. Elijah noticed it first when the console and maintenance subdeck C lit up. He hadn't powered that terminal in weeks. It was a diagnostic relic, meant to track hull stress during meteor showers. Useless now. Except it wasn't. He stood staring as lines of shifting spiral glyphs flickered across the screen. No text. No recognizable system prompts. Just rhythm. Pattern. Pulse. He reached for the comm line, then thought better of it. Instead, he ran. Kari arrived minutes later, breathless from climbing 2 decks. When she saw the display, she didn't speak. Her eyes widened, then softened. "It's replicating the signal," she said. Elijah nodded. "But this time, it's not reaching inward." She stepped closer to the console, laid her palm over the screen. The spiral brightened. "It's broadcasting." Elijah's throat tightened. "Broadcasting what?" She turned to him. Not a message. A presence. Like a bloom releasing spores. They ran together to the old comms tower. What was left of it? The main dish was still scrap, but the internal coil relays had come alive, glowing faintly with the same unearthly hue that pulsed from the seed. That hue now seemed to pulse from everywhere. "This is impossible," Elijah whispered. "There's no transmitter left." "There doesn't need to be," Kari said, because it wasn't transmitting through tech anymore. The station was the signal. Every conduit, every beam, every echo of memory. Each pulse was a rhythm, a breath, a heartbeat shared not between machines, but between systems once dead and voices that had grieved. Kari laid her hand on the bulkhead. "It's calling," she said. "To what?" Elijah asked. She didn't answer. Not with words. The moss around them vibrated in time with their breathing. Not mimicking. Mirroring. And then the station shuddered. A soft, deep tremor. Not destructive. Transformative. The playback unit on the command deck bloomed again, fractals of light rising from its base like petals unfolding. The walls of the chamber shifted in hue, showing not color, but memory traces. Echoes of voices. Footsteps from long ago. The residue of emotion mapped across metal. Elijah saw his father's laugh, one he hadn't heard since he was 12, reflected in the shimmer of a bulkhead. Kari saw a funeral song once sung in silence, now replayed in harmonics no throat could replicate. They stood in it, immersed. On the seedbed, where they had planted what they couldn't name, the soil glowed. Not with light. With response. A pulse of acknowledgement that surged up through the hydroponics dome and into the station's spine. Every system not only responded, it adapted. The emergency beacon relays, which hadn't fired in years, flared to life, but not in distress. They pulsed in triplet rhythm. A wave. A welcome. And above the station, in the black quiet of Anseth orbit, something changed. Stars flickered. Once. Twice. Then a ripple passed through space. Not visible, but felt. Across systems. Across minds. Like a tone played not to ears, but to memory itself. Across the chasm of dead signals and scorched treaties, something old stirred in return. Elijah collapsed into the nearest console seat, breath ragged. He felt dizzy. Not from exhaustion. From knowing. Some part of him, not conscious, not trained, knew the ripple wasn't random. The bloom had reached beyond. And someone, somewhere, had heard it. Kari whispered, "It's not just remembering now." He turned toward her. Her eyes shimmered with the same glow he'd seen in the playback chamber. "What's it doing?" he asked. Kari looked at the ceiling, at the moss, at the growing pulse under her feet. "It's answering back." Kari blinked hard, as if waking inside a lucid dream. "It's rewriting the idea of a signal," she said. "This isn't just a reply. It's reciprocation. Synthesis." She touched the wall again. "I don't know how this is possible." And that, perhaps, was what made it sacred. Then, as if drawn by the rhythm, she knelt and placed both hands on the floor. The moss spiraled beneath her palms. And in that moment, every screen on Kepler Concord lit up, maintenance terminals, dormant displays, cracked security cams. A single spiral appeared. Not violet, not green, but white. A spiral made of absence. Not erasure, not void. A spiral that said, "We see you now." The spiral was the first thing they'd seen together. The glyph that had changed everything. Grief had shaped it. Hope had sustained it. Now it had become a greeting. The seed chamber pulsed. And in orbit above them, a shape unfolded from starlight, angular, slow, vast, its motion more like thought than propulsion. Something was answering. And it was coming down. The descent wasn't silent. Not in the way machines move, or atmospheres burn, or gravity drags metal through void, but in the way ancient memories hum behind the eyes. The shape above Kepler Concord was vast, crystalline in design, ever-shifting like frost patterns on obsidian. It had no thrusters, no lights. Yet it moved. Every motion felt intentional, as if it had waited eons for an invitation. The vessel moved like gravity with awareness. It didn't disturb space, it folded through it. Its surface bent starlight, reshaping constellations, making old things new. Those who might have once called it a ship would have misunderstood. It was a messenger, a memory made manifest. Kari and Elijah stood beneath the main viewport in the hydroponics dome, where moss now climbed the walls like cathedral vines. Green overtook rust, woven into the seams of the old walls, softening the violence that once scarred them. Neither spoke. They simply watched the ship descend, a presence larger than translation. "I think it's grown before," Elijah said quietly. "The seed. This whole thing. Maybe on other worlds. Other ruins." Kari didn't answer right away. Her fingers brushed the pulse lines in the glass, feeling not vibration, but awareness. "I think the seed remembers all of them," she said. "And now, it's showing them to us." The playback unit glowed behind them. Symbols streamed across its surface, spirals, yes, but now joined by curves, crescents, fractal veining like neural maps and root systems interwoven. And then, memory unfolded. Not in screens or words, but within them. Through them, images passed across their minds like tide over reef. Planets scorched by silence. Stations gone hollow. Worlds where no species survived, but memories did. Not stored, not archived. Carried. By moss, by echo, by soil. Places where the last breath of a dying people became the seed of something else. And on each world, something had been left behind. Something small. Green. Quiet. A seed. Each seed a beginning. Not a second chance. A witness. "It's never been about saving," Kari whispered. "It's about witnessing." Planting remembrance where silence fell. The vessel above the station halted, hovering miles above the orbital ring. Its shape bent the light in ways that twisted reflection into geometry. Kari's voice dropped again. "It's not a ship," she said. "It's a receiver. Part of something older," she added. "Maybe they never speak. Maybe they just gather. Carry the memory to where it's most needed." Elijah swallowed. "For what?" "For us." The moss shimmered in reply. Not in panic. Not in warning. But in welcome. The playback unit bloomed again, But this time it did not form spirals. Instead, it formed a gate. A ring of symbols stretched wide in the air above the soil bed, radiant with soft white glow. Vines wove through the projection as if the memory was alive. At its center, the seed. It had risen from the soil. No hands had lifted it. It responded to presence. It no longer pulsed. It sang, not in tones audible to human or Thalkaiar ears, but in memory. Scenes passed through Elijah's mind, not his own, but shared. A Thalkaiar child planting sorrow lilies after her sibling's death. A Terran engineer leaving a last log, fingers shaking, saying, "Please remember us." A ring of moss growing around a crashed escape pod on a dead world. The silent scream of a forgotten people absorbed into root and dust and wind. Elijah's throat clenched. It kept it all. Kari was crying. It never forgot. The playback gate expanded. Vines wreathed its circumference, growing not outward, but in. It wasn't opening to space. It was opening inward, into memory, into a network of shared grief and renewal, into something older than history, something sacred. Kari turned slowly toward Elijah. "It's asking," she whispered. "It wants to know if we'll take the seed and go." Elijah looked at her. At the gate. At the ship. At the station they had rebuilt and rebirthed leaf by stubborn leaf. Elijah hesitated. "It's strange. I thought I'd die here fixing things I didn't break. But now, it's alive. And I'm the one who has to leave." "Go where?" Kari smiled. Not with certainty, but with faith. "Where we're needed." He stepped forward and took her hand. They moved toward the gate together, the moss parting like silk. The air smelled of wet earth and starlight. A warmth pulsed beneath their boots, ancient, steady, like the heartbeat of a world. The light held steady. And then Kari paused. Looked back at the hydroponics bay, at the moss blooming along the control panels, at the cracks where life had pushed through. She spoke, not to Elijah, not to the ship, but to the station. "To remember is to forgive," she said. "And to grow," Elijah added. As they stepped through, the spiral flared one last time. White. Whole. And then Kepler Concord was alone again. Except for the green. Except for the song. Systems dimmed into silence. Lights went low. But the moss continued to climb. And somewhere, far beyond the known systems, a new bloom took root on a world forgotten by time. A child found a strange flower growing through stone. A melody no one taught her played behind her thoughts, low and warm, like the whisper of a memory passed from star to star. And in the wind, the seed remembered. Always.